Right, so my name is Theodor Nenu. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bristol. I work on logic. And today I'm gonna talk about one particular attempt of trying to use a famous mathematical result in order to shed light on classical mind-body problems. The result, as you can guess, is Gödel's first incompleteness theorem, also known as G1. And for those of you that don't know its statement, it says that any recursively axiomatized theory which extends beyond arithmetic cannot be both consistent and complete. And perhaps you've heard about what I call the negative Gödelian thesis of Lucas and Penrose, which aim to use the above result to argue for limitations of computational account of minds. I won't talk about that at all. I'll talk about a positive Gödelian thesis, which aims to shed light on the interaction between minds and lower brain levels through analogies with elements contained in the proof of G1, not G1 itself. And the main figure behind this thesis is Douglas Richard Hofstadter, who has fleshed out his thoughts at great length in Gödel, Escher, Bach in 1979, a 777-page book, but also more recently in I Am a Strange Loop in 2007. So the main focus today is the mental causation and selfhood as Gödelian strange loops. I'll have to say what's the strange loop behind Gödel's theorem, what does he mean about that term, and so on. But they are quite hard to define, although it's easy to exemplify them. Usually there are two kinds of strange loop, the genuine and the fake. Regarding the genuine, those are quite scarce, but consider the following famous sentence. The sentence displayed on this slide is not true. Is that sentence true? Well, if it is, then what it says has to be the case, so it isn't. But if it isn't, then what it says is true after all, so it's true. I mean, you might say that this is a parlor trick, but it's quite a serious one because Gödel pulled off a liar-like trick with a syntactic notion of formal provability instead of the semantic notion of truth in order to prove G1. And for Hofstadter, as I said, the proof of G1 contains a prime example of a genuine strange loop. I'll get to that a bit later, but now I want to say that most strange loops are illusory, including those related to minds. So here's an example of a fake one. You have Escher's drawing hands illusions. So this is a paradoxical state of affairs whereby you have two hands, each of which is brought into existence by the other, but also brings the other into existence. But yeah, this is a tricky one. I mean, it's not genuinely paradoxical. The universe won't explode suddenly because of this loop. There's no crack in the fabric of reality. It's not instantiated in reality. And the loop manifests only at the appropriate vantage point. I mean, if you zoom out far enough and you get to the drawer, Escher, the loop obviously dissolves, it pops. So you have to take into consideration inviolate levels. And similarly, something will happen with minds where the level of neurons will be the inviolate levels. So brains as physical systems have to be analyzed and should be analyzed, as Hofstadter points out, at the various hierarchical brain levels. You have the levels of particle physics. You might zoom out from that to get the level of neurons. You zoom out from that to get the level of symbols. You zoom out even further and you have the level of the mind. And here is an important question. How does causality interplay between those levels? I mean, this is the problem of mental causation, roughly. The problem is that we have two difficulties, D1 and D2. The first one is that we intuitively feel that we are the authors of our actions. We feel that causation happens at the level of the mind. But also through cold scientific reflection, we want to say that causality goes bottom up through the levels. I mean, and if you put those together, you're kind of stuck in a loopy scenario. And as a spoiler, Hofstadter will say why the intuition behind D1 is illusory. D2 is technically true, but we might grossly undersell mental causation if we leave it like that. And parallels with Gödel's theorems should shed some nice light on this problem. But first of all, I mentioned two things, symbols and minds. What does he mean by a symbol? So a symbol is a brain structure which corresponds to categories. So it's a bundle of teamed up neurons which gets activated whenever the creature in question thinks about or directly perceives an instance of the concept that the symbol is implementing. So it's basically the hardware counterpart to concepts. You have symbols, well, Hofstadter says so, you have symbols in your brain which corresponds to zebras or the letter A, and the symbols found in human brains mirror the macro level reality. So the reality that you are most intimately familiar with, what philosopher Wilfrid Sellars calls the manifest image. The self symbol, When you're born, Hofstadter says there's a seed of selfhood. But through environmental and social feedback loops, the self symbol grows and gets sharpened as year goes by. So by the time you're, say, 20, you have a very good self symbol in play. And this complex and overgrown symbol happens at a higher hierarchical level. So it's, again, a neural pattern, but it's a pattern made out of patterns. So it sort of hosts other interactive symbols. Those might be episodic memories, things that you directly perceive right now, and so on. And Hofstadter sort of bypasses David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness. He just says that awareness and consciousness are just the monitoring of brain activity by this curious self symbol. And now, I gave you a spoiler of mental causation. Now I have to give you the whole movie. Those two difficulties, as I said, catch us in a loopy scenario. But just as in the Escher case, if you zoom out far enough, you get to the inviolate level of neurons. I mean, because we don't fully experience it, because we experience macro level reality, we might mistakenly believe that there is no inviolate level, but there is. And ultimately, neural activity dictates everything, but there is so much more to it. Although, I also said that he explains away the intuition behind D1 about our feeling as causal loci. I mean, why is that? We feel ourselves as authors of our actions because of an illusion of thinking, which is owed to two factors. First of all, that we're thinking creatures. What is thinking in Hofstadter's conception? Well, thought, obviously, must depend on representing reality in the hardware of the brain. And we evolved to perceive reality at our macro level. And this is reflected in our symbolic network. And crucially for him, thinking is nothing more than taking trips or journeys through the symbolic network. And because of that, we have a hardware limitation, which constrains thinking. Because of this nature of symbols that they mirror macro level reality, we sort of lack the required hardware to peer into the lower levels of the world and of the brain. And getting a PhD in neuropsychology won't change that, because you're so used to the level that you experience that you'll never be able to wash this intuition away. And now it's interesting to ask ourselves, why the parallel with Gödel? Well, Gödel's work supposedly sheds some light on causal relationship between high and low levels in a formal system. Also, self-consciousness and self-reference seem to have something similar. I mean, we know that formal systems of sufficient arithmetical strength are guaranteed to exhibit self-referentiality through diagonal means. If you've heard of diagonal arguments, you have the diagonal lemma, which gives you fixed points of certain predicates. We also conjecture that physical systems, such as brains of sufficient complexity, are guaranteed as well to exhibit self-referentiality. This is a conjecture, but it is a nice analogy because we know that brains are fairly complex. And formal systems, through the fixed points that I was just talking about, presumably get a metaphorical self through those diagonal means. And mental systems also have this self symbol that I was talking about. And the self symbol is obtained when the brain structures which mirror the world, symbols, sort of suddenly start mirroring themselves. Again, it's not a tight argument, it's an analogy and a metaphor. That's how Hofstadter uses the Gödelian parallels. But let's examine them more clearly. He wants to say that mental causation is an intrinsically high-level phenomenon. That is, you cannot possibly understand or grasp it at lower levels. And compare it with Gödel. Say someone wants to prove the Gödel sentence of piano arithmetic inside piano arithmetic, and she just does that by toying with the axioms and rules of inference mechanically at low level. She will never be able to perceive the impossibility of the task from that low level. You have to zoom out and take a high-level vantage point in order for this to make sense. And when you take this high-level perspective, you realize that the Gödel sentence of PA has a dual meaning. It has a high-level meaning whereby it states its own unprovability, but it also has a low-level meaning where it's just an ordinary number theoretic plane, like Goldbach's conjecture. And it is because of this high-level meaning that piano arithmetic cannot formally decide its Gödel sentence. Usually in mathematics, when we talk of proofs, we imagine them going from the bottom up. But in this case, just looking at the high-level meaning, we sort of realize what its syntactic status must be. It has to be unprovable. So you have a sort of real strange downward causal phenomenon which manifests itself in metamathematics. And Hofstadter thinks that this might enable us to view mental causation with fresh eyes. So he says the following in Gödel, Escher, Bach. And this is where my analogy to brains and cells comes in, suggesting that a mere brain pattern called I can shove around inanimate particles in the brain no less than inanimate particles in the brain can shove around patterns. I mean, I have a problem with that because it seems to me that there is a bit of an equivocation of the word causation. I mean, mental causation seems to have a different flavor than mathematical downward causation, because in mathematical reality, there's no causation. What does causation mean in mathematics? There's no shoving around. The mathematical relationships and state of affairs are timeless and unchanging. And mathematical reality is replete with abstract objects which lack special temporal positions and are causally impotent. So how can we draw parallels with Gödel's work to say something about mental selves shoving around things? I mean, maybe the high-level meaning is an abstract reason, but is it a cause? Well, Hofstadter has an answer because I asked him, and I also reviewed a bit of his work, but due to time constraints, I have to bypass it or answer it in the Q&A. Sorry for that. But another reason that, another thing that I want to mention, isn't sophisticated mathematics redundant to make this point about the unavoidability of taking high-level perspectives? I mean, first of all, we cannot appeal to Gödel to understand how mental selves crop up in brains because we know how arithmetical selves crop up in mathematical context through diagonalization, because the parallel is not watertight. And also there are important differences. Mathematical selves lack fuzziness, don't die, don't change. I mean, there are multiple Gödel sentences depending on what probability predicate you pick. So you have multiple equally real personalities, an infinite number of them, and so on. So there are important differences. The only real role the first incompleteness theorem can play in Hofstadter's project is to serve as an example that with certain syntactic objects, myopic perspectives cannot possibly be inside the form. But this point can be delivered without spending hundreds of pages on a theorem. I mean, you can pick your chessboard as a syntactic object, you have this initial configuration, and suppose white wants to checkmate black. So instead of trying to formally prove Gödel's sentences through axioms and rule of inference mechanically low level, now we're trying to checkmate through the mechanical rules of chess. And I can give you the lesson as follows. No amount of moving the pieces according to the rules of chess would enable white to understand why checkmating black with the king and a knight through the mechanical low-level rules of chess is impossible. I mean, the only way in which one could grasp the impossibility of arriving at the checkmate configuration from the depicted configuration is by taking a high-level perspective on the chessboard where this insight becomes mathematically available. But still, I want to pour some water even on the downward causal insights. I mean, we sort of assumed and granted Hofstadter so far that mathematical meanings exhibit some sort of metaphorical causal powers, but do they? I mean, he says that the Gödel sentence of PA is formally undecidable because it says it is. Well, let's see whether this thesis always holds up. I mean, this is an important remark. If even this thesis turns out to be false, then combined with what we've said before about being able to deliver the main insights through easier means, we cannot say that we can illuminate classical mind-body problems such as selfhood or mental causation through analogies with Gödel's work. I mean, it's a nice metaphor, but still. First of all, how do sentences obtain these high-level meanings in the first place? Volker Halbach and Albert Wieser single out three sources of intentionality. You have to fix up a coding scheme, you have to fix up a formula which is used to express the desired syntactic properties such as unprovability, and then you take some diagonal fixed points of that through which are handed out to you through the diagonal lemma. Here's an interesting question which was posed by Henkin in 1952. So pick a formal arithmetic such as Hofstadter's typographical number theory, which is similar to PA, but there are some some unimportant differences. And you can construct then an arbitrary provability predicate and consider its canonical fixed point. It's Henkin's sentence instead of the Gödel sentence, the sentence which says about itself that it's provable, not unprovable. Henkin's question should be trivial through Hofstadter's lenses, because of course it is provable because it says that it is provable. But recent results which are given in Halbach's and Visser's papers show that you can pick 3 suitable probability predicates which do the required job in the first incompleteness theorem, such as the canonical fixed points are in turn provable, undecidable, and more or less refutable. And the last one is important for pouring cold water on Hofstadter's thesis. So through his tacitly assumed thesis, Hofstadter would have wrongly predicted that all of them are provable. Well, maybe there's a way out. He could say, he doesn't do that, but I'm trying to cook up a response on his behalf, that he's only interested in probability predicates which obey what are known as Lob's conditions. I mean, perhaps that's what real probability predicates do. I won't go through the conditions because of lack of time, but what I want to point out is that a Gödel sentence or a Henkin sentence, if you flesh it out, it's a huge, absolutely gargantuan arithmetical string, which, if you don't know how to parse it and mentally chunk it, you'll have no clue whether it satisfies Lob's conditions or not. I mean, it is only because of our robust understanding of the metamathematics being involved in the proof of G1 that we can make those sweeping claims. But when it comes to the brain, I mean, I don't know how to look at it, to be honest. I mean, Hofstadter even assumes that we have symbols and the self symbols. I'm not sure that contemporary neuroscience supports this tight link between concepts and symbol in the way that Hofstadter does it. I mean, when he says that we can just look at a Gödel-like sentence to infer its status, we have to remember that this inference is done in a developed epistemological mathematical background, and we cannot do similar mentalistic inferences in an underdeveloped neuropsychological background. So without a rich understanding of how the relevant syntactic self, mathematical or mental, was constructing, all those downward causal insights simply dissolve. And Hofstadter left no guidance or instructions when it comes to the mind. And with that, with that in place, I'm done. Thank you.